the 27th of December, 1831. A small ship is working her way out of the harbour into a grey winter sea, and standing on her deck, 22 years old, is a young man named Charles Darwin. He has no scientific job, no salary. He is not the ship's official naturalist. That post belongs to someone else on board. His own father did not want him to go. He was told this voyage would last 2 years. It is going to last 5. Watch him for a second before the coast disappears, because he will never be this person again. Everything he was taught about the age of the earth, about mountains, about the animals living on it, he still believes all of it, whole, exactly the way it was handed to him. In a few years he's going to be standing 3,000 meters up an Andean mountainside with seashells in his hand, packed into the rock of the mountain itself, and he will not be able to explain them. He does not know that yet. Right now he is just cold and about to be extremely seasick. The ship is called the Beagle. Let's go with him. And if you enjoy these journeys, leave a like and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I love knowing that people thousands of miles apart can all end up inside the same story at the same moment. So settle in and get comfortable. Now, before we go any further, you have to picture this ship properly, starting with her dimensions. 90 feet long, 24 feet wide. That is roughly the length of 2 buses parked end to end, and about as wide as a small bedroom is long. She's a 10-gun brig of a class the Navy nicknamed the Coffin Brigs, because they had a habit of going down in heavy weather, and there are 74 people on board. Officers, midshipmen, seamen, marines, a ship's boy or two, an artist, an instrument maker, a missionary, and a handful of passengers. 74 human beings on a vessel you could walk the length of in about 20 seconds. Darwin's quarters are the poop cabin at the stern. It is roughly 10 feet by 11. In the middle of it stands a large chart table, because this is a surveying ship, and charts are the entire point of her existence. Around the walls are drawers, a washstand, bookcases holding a working library of around 400 volumes, and Darwin's microscope. There is no bed. There is no room for a bed. He sleeps in a hammock slung over the chart table, and he shares the cabin with a 19-year-old assistant surveyor and at times a 14-year-old midshipman. To get into that hammock, he has to climb up over the table in the dark. It took him several attempts to learn the technique. He recorded the date he finally managed it. For the next 5 years, that is his home, his office, his laboratory, and his library, all at once, in a space smaller than a modern garage, on a ship that is almost never still. And now the part that explains why he is there at all. The captain is Robert Fitzroy, and he is 26 years old. 4 years older than Darwin. He is a gifted surveyor, an obsessive one, and he is carrying 22 chronometers aboard, because one of the goals of this voyage is to run a chain of longitude measurements the whole way around the planet and close the circle on itself. He is also afraid of something, and it is the reason there is a young man from Cambridge on his deck. The Beagle's previous captain had commanded her through the channels at the bottom of South America. Foul weather, no relief, months of grey, a crew falling ill, and no one aboard he could talk to as an equal, because a captain in that navy did not have equals. In August 1828, at an anchorage at the southern tip of the continent, he took his own life. Fitzroy replaced him, and Fitzroy knew that his own family had a history of the same kind of darkness. So when he was given the ship for a second voyage, he asked for something unusual. Permission to bring aboard an educated gentleman who could keep him company at his own table. Someone outside the chain of command, someone he could simply talk to. That person would pay his own way. He could collect whatever he liked. The offer went through a chain of professors at Cambridge and landed, almost by accident, on a young man who'd been studying to become a country clergyman and who was much better at collecting beetles than at anything else he had ever attempted. And Fitzroy very nearly turned him down when they met, because of his nose. That is not a joke, and it is worth explaining properly because it tells you something real about 1831. There was a widely held belief at the time called physiognomy, the idea that a person's character was legible in the structure of their face. Serious people believed it. Fitzroy was one of them. And on meeting Darwin, he privately doubted that anyone with a nose shaped like that possessed enough energy and determination for a voyage of this kind. Darwin found this out later and thought it was hilarious. He wrote about it himself decades afterwards, with obvious delight, that he had passed the test only because the rest of his face argued his case for him. Hold that image. The most consequential passenger in the history of scientific travel almost lost his seat over the shape of his nose, and the man judging him was measuring against a science that turned out to be worthless. Now the seasickness. Darwin was violently, continuously, miserably seasick, and not just for the first week. For 5 years, it never resolved. It came back every time the weather did. He worked out that the only thing that helped was lying flat in his hammock and eating raisins, and he spent a great deal of this voyage doing exactly that. Which brings us to a number that changes how you should picture this whole story. Of the 5 years he was away, Darwin spent roughly 3 years and 3 months on land, 18 months at sea. He was not, in any meaningful sense, a sailor. He was a young man who used a Royal Navy survey ship as a taxi, got off it at every opportunity, and went inland on horseback for weeks at a time, while the officers stayed behind and measured coastlines. Almost everything you're about to hear happened on foot, on a mule, or on a borrowed horse, hundreds of kilometres from the ship. The Beagle crosses the Bay of Biscay in bad weather. Darwin lies in his hammock and wonders what he has done, and on the 16th of January 1832, they anchor off an island in the Cape Verde group, off the west coast of Africa. He goes ashore, and within a few hours he sees something that starts the whole thing. It is a cliff face above the shoreline, and running horizontally through it, perfectly level, is a white band about a foot thick. He climbs up to it and looks closely, and the white band is made of seashells and crushed coral. Compressed, cemented into rock, the kind of debris you would find at the bottom of shallow warm water. It is roughly 45 feet above the sea. Stand with him a moment here, since everything downstream grows out of this. A layer of ancient seabed, dead flat, running through the side of a hill well above the reach of any wave. It did not float up there. The water did not stand that high and then drain away, because the band is horizontal and continuous, and there is volcanic rock both above and below it. Which leaves one explanation. The land came up, slowly, over an enormous span of time. This island rose out of the sea and lifted an old ocean floor into the air with it. Darwin has a book with him in his cabin, given to him just before departure. It is the first volume of a work by a geologist named Charles Lyell, and its central argument is that the Earth is shaped not by sudden catastrophes, but by ordinary processes: rain, wind, tides, small earthquakes, operating for spans of time so long they're almost impossible to hold in your head. Standing at that white band, Darwin later said, he realised he might be able to write a book about geology himself, 3 weeks into a 5-year voyage. It was the first ambitious thought he had ever had about his own abilities. Remember that band of shells 45 feet up a hillside, because in 3 years he's going to be looking at the same thing, made of the same material, at 3,000 metres on the other side of the world. And the question of how it got there is going to open into something much larger. There is one more thing that happens in the Cape Verdes, and it is the kind of detail that most people have never heard. Dust falls on the ship, not once, repeatedly. A fine brown dust that drifts down out of a hazy sky, coats the decks, gets into everyone's eyes, and settles on the astronomical instruments finely enough to affect the readings. Sailors in these waters were used to it. Ships had run aground in the murk it created. Darwin, being who he is, collects some of it. He scrapes a small packet of the dust out of the gauze at the masthead and puts it away. Years later, he sends 5 small packets of that dust to a specialist in Berlin who works with a microscope at the limit of what the sentry could do. And in those 5 tiny packets, the man identifies 67 different organic forms, microscopic shelled organisms, plant tissue, life, essentially, dried out, lifted into the atmosphere and carried out over open ocean. And here is the part that made Darwin sit up. Almost all of those organisms were freshwater species, not marine. They had come off land, off dried riverbeds and lake bottoms, and they'd been carried hundreds of kilometres out to sea on the wind. Ships had recorded this dust falling more than 1,000 miles from the African coast, which means the air itself is a transport system. Things get moved around this planet by processes nobody's watching, over distances nobody was measuring all the time. File that away too. It becomes relevant when we reach a set of volcanic islands in the Pacific with a very strange collection of animals on them. The Beagle sails southwest, crosses the equator, and Darwin is subjected to the traditional ceremony for a first crossing, which in 1832 involved being blindfolded, doused and lathered with a mixture the sailors made up specially. He took it in good humour and mentioned it in his diary. They stop at St. Paul's Rocks, a cluster of bare rock in the middle of the Atlantic, barely more than a reef sticking out of deep water. There is no soil. There are no plants. There are 2 species of bird, some crabs, spiders, and a great many insects. And Darwin makes an observation there that is quietly one of the sharpest of the entire voyage. He works out what the food chain on that rock is actually built from. The birds fish the ocean. The birds return to the rock. What the birds bring back, droppings, scraps, feathers, the occasional dead bird, is the entire nutritional input of the island. Everything else living there is feeding on that, directly or indirectly. A tiny closed system, running on nothing but what falls out of the sky and washes off the sea. He is 23 years old, and he is already doing something almost nobody was doing at the time, not just naming what lives somewhere, but asking how it manages to be there at all. Then, at night, the sea starts to burn. In tropical waters, the wake of the ship lights up. It happens because of microscopic organisms in the water that emit light when disturbed, and on a dark night in the right conditions, the effect is overwhelming. The entire path the ship has cut through the ocean glows pale green behind her, and the crests of the waves flare white when they break, and the water thrown off the bow falls back into the sea as sparks. Darwin, who is standing watch in a state of near-permanent nausea and wonder, writes about it as one of the most beautiful things he has ever seen. He also, being Darwin, gets a bucket, hauls some of the water aboard, and puts it under the microscope to find out what is doing it. In one gesture, that is how this whole 5 years works. He is enchanted by something, and then he goes and finds out what it is made of, and the finding out never once ruins it. On the 28th of February 1832, the Beagle anchors off Bahia in Brazil, and Charles Darwin walks into a tropical rainforest for the first time in his life. Nothing in his experience has prepared him for it. He grew up in the English Midlands. He knows woodland, oak, ash, beech, birdsong, a certain amount of rain. What he steps into at Bahia is a different category of thing altogether. The first thing that hits is the noise. It is not quiet. It is nowhere close to quiet. The sound of insects in that forest is loud enough that it can be heard from a ship lying offshore several hundred meters out on the water. A wall of sound from an animal you cannot see, produced by creatures that individually weigh less than a coin. Then the scale. Trees going up and up past any height he has a reference for, with the canopy closing overhead so completely that the forest floor is in a green half-light in the middle of the day. Vines the thickness of a man's arm, hanging and looping and strangling. Parasitic plants living on other plants which are themselves living on other plants. Ferns the size of trees. And the density of life is the thing that actually breaks him. He starts turning over rotting logs. Under one log he finds a flatworm, several beetles, ants of 3 different kinds, a spider, and a small snake. He goes to another log and finds a different set entirely. He is a trained collector, and he understands almost immediately that he cannot collect this. There is too much. He could spend a lifetime in a single square kilometre of this forest, and not finish it. He wrote in his diary that his mind was in a chaos of delight, and that the sensation was like giving a blind man eyes. But he does not just gape at it. He watches, and he notices things, and some of them are extraordinary. He watches a wasp attack a spider much larger than itself, sting it precisely, paralyze it, and drag it away. Alive, not dead, to be buried with an egg, so that the wasp larva will hatch into a supply of fresh meat that cannot run. He finds leaf-cutter ants moving in a column, thousands of them, each carrying a cut fragment of green leaf many times its own size, following a cleared trail through the undergrowth that generations of ants have worn into the ground. He watches a frog climb a vertical pane of glass. He tests it, because he does not believe it, and it does it again. He collects a species of octopus in a tidal pool that changes colour as he holds it, running through shades in seconds, and he is so excited that he writes to his old teacher in Cambridge announcing that he has discovered something new to science. He had not. Colour-changing cephalopods were already well known, and his teacher wrote back and told him so, gently. It is a good detail to hold on to, because it is a reminder of what he actually was at this stage. A keen, slightly overconfident 23-year-old amateur, guessing wrong in public and learning. He spends months in Brazil, and it is during this stretch that he and Fitzroy have a furious argument in the captain's cabin over a political question on which the two of them held opposite and immovable views, Fitzroy defending a position Darwin found indefensible. It escalated far enough that Darwin was told he could no longer dine at the captain's table, which on a ship that size would have made the remaining years unbearable. Fitzroy sent an apology within hours. Darwin accepted it. They never fully agreed on the subject, and they both knew it, and they went back to work. Keep that in mind as we go, because the relationship between those two men, respectful, genuinely affectionate, and permanently one argument away from disaster, runs underneath this entire voyage. Now the Beagle turns south, down the coast of the continent, toward a stretch of low, reddish cliffs on the Argentine shore. And this is where the story really begins, because this is where Charles Darwin puts a pickaxe into the side of a hill and pulls out something that does not exist anywhere on Earth. The date is the 22nd of September, 1832. The place is called Punta Alta, near Bahia Blanca on the coast of Argentina. It is not an impressive spot. Despite the name, which means high point, The cliff is about 20 feet of soft reddish mudstone above beach. Fitzroy and Darwin take a small boat over from the anchorage, 10 miles away, mainly because Darwin wants to look at rocks, and then he sees the shapes in the cliff face. Not small shapes, large ones, bones, sticking out of the mud, and not the kind of bones a person recognizes. He borrows a pickaxe, gets a shipmate to help, and starts digging. He does not stop for weeks. Over that first session and the visits that follow, Charles Darwin pulls the remains of 9 enormous mammals out of that low bank of mud, and almost every one of them is either unknown to science or barely known. He works until after dark. On one of those days he does not get back to the ship until long after nightfall, and when he does, he is carrying a fossilized skull the size of a barrel. Let me tell you what he actually dug out, because the list is astonishing. There is a giant ground sloth, an animal in the same family as the small, slow, tree-dwelling sloths of the South American forest, except this one is the size of a modern elephant and weighs several tons. It could not possibly have lived in a tree. It stood on the ground, and there is reasonable evidence it could rear up on its hind legs and haul branches down. There is a second giant sloth, and a third. They come in sizes. There is a huge armoured animal, its shell built out of interlocking bony plates fused into a rigid dome, essentially an armadillo enlarged to the dimensions of a small car. There is something Darwin could not place at all. An animal with a skull unlike anything in the known world. It would eventually be named Toxodon, and Darwin himself later called it perhaps one of the strangest animals ever discovered. A creature with teeth suggesting it grazed like a cow, a body suggesting it was built like a rhinoceros, and a skeleton that placed it apparently close to nothing living. There is an animal with a long neck and a camel-like build that will be named Macrauchenia, and there is a tooth from an extinct horse. Now hold on to that last one, because it is quietly the most disturbing item on the list. When the Beagle arrived in South America, there were horses everywhere on those plains. Wild herds, gaucho mounts, thousands of them, and every single one of them was descended from animals brought over from Europe in the 16th century. The continent had no horses when the Spanish arrived. Not one, but there had been horses there, native ones, and they had died out completely and left nothing but teeth in a mud bank. And then, thousands of years later, Europeans arrived by sea and released a different kind of horse onto the same grass, and it thrived. Darwin worked this out and found it deeply strange. The land was clearly capable of supporting horses. It had supported them before. Something had removed them anyway, but the thing that stops him, the thing that is going to sit in the back of his mind for the rest of the voyage and the rest of his life, is not in the bones at all. It is in the layer they are buried in, because the same beds that hold these giants also hold seashells, and the shells are not exotic. They are not ancient, unrecognizable species. They are ordinary shells, and Darwin can walk down to the beach directly below the cliff and find the same species alive in the water that same afternoon. Stay with that a moment, since in 1832 the idea is close to unthinkable. The standard understanding at the time was that extinct creatures belonged to a vanished world, a separate creation, an era that had been swept away wholesale by some catastrophe, after which the world was restocked. Fossils were relics of a different order of things, and the shells you find on the beach today are from the current one. Darwin is holding both in the same handful of mud, which means these giants were not from some unimaginably distant epoch. They were here recently enough that the small animals sharing their world are in many cases still here. Their world is our world. Nothing has been swept away and replaced. The shellfish carried on, the giants did not. And it gets stranger, because look at what he had actually dug up. A giant sloth. And there are sloths living in South America right now. A giant armadillo. And there are armadillos living in South America right now. Darwin had been eating them. The gauchos roasted them in their shells and he thought they tasted like duck, a camel-like animal with a long neck. And there are guanacos and llamas walking around South America right now. The pattern is not subtle once you see it. The extinct giants of that continent are, again and again, oversized versions of the small animals still living on the exact same ground. The same body plans, the same continent, the same neighborhood. One set is bones in a cliff. The other set is out on the plain eating grass, and Darwin can shoot one for dinner. He wrote that this relationship between the dead and the living of the same land would throw more light on the appearance of species than any other class of facts. He did not know what the light would show. That is the point. He had no explanation, and he would not have one for years. But the question is now planted, and it is going to follow us the whole way around this planet. Why did the giants disappear when their small relations are still standing on the same ground? Nothing had happened to that land that the shellfish noticed. No flood, no fire, no obvious catastrophe. The beach below the cliff was still running normally. And yet every one of the largest land animals on the continent was gone, and everything under a certain size was fine. Hold on to that. It comes back before the night is over, and when it does, you may be surprised how much of it remains genuinely unsettled in 2026. For now, Darwin packs the bones in straw and barrels, and they go into crates, and the crates go onto the next ship home. And here is the part that nobody tells you about this voyage. He never finds out what he has got. Every crate goes to his old teacher in Cambridge. From there, the fossils go to specialists in London. But a letter takes months to reach South America, and the Beagle is constantly moving, and mail chases her around the continent and frequently misses. For 2 years, Darwin has no idea whether his fossils even arrived in England. For all he knows, the ship carrying them went down, and every bone he broke his back extracting from that cliff is on the seabed of the Atlantic. He keeps digging anyway. He keeps packing crates and sending them into a silence, on the assumption that someone at the other end is receiving them. When a letter from his teacher finally reaches him, confirming that the fossils arrived and are causing genuine excitement in London, he goes back to work with something close to fever. That silence matters. Everything you are about to watch him see, he sees without answers. Nobody is confirming anything for him. He is filling boxes with questions and mailing them across an ocean, and he will not learn what most of them mean until he is home. Now, while the Beagle's officers are surveying the coastline, and that is what this voyage is officially for. Charts for the Royal Navy, thousands of soundings, a coastline drawn accurately for the first time. Darwin does what he always does. He gets off the ship and rides inland. He falls in with gauchos, the horsemen of the Argentine plains, and travels with them for weeks, and his account of them is one of the warmest things in his entire journal. He admires them enormously. He is impressed by their skill on a horse in a way that borders on hero worship. They teach him to use the bolus. 3 stones on cords, whirled and thrown at the legs of a running animal to bring it down. This is a weapon that requires enormous practice, and Darwin practices. On horseback, at a gallop, he whirls the bolus over his head, releases, and successfully brings down a running animal. It is his own horse. The stones wrapped around his mount's hind legs, the horse went over, and Darwin went with it. He wrote afterwards that the gauchos had never seen anything funnier in their lives. A man who had managed to catch himself. He also eats his way across the continent, and he does it deliberately. He'd belonged to a dining club at Cambridge dedicated to eating unusual animals, and he continues the project on this voyage with real enthusiasm. Armadillo, which he liked. Puma, which he thought tasted like veal. Iguana, an enormous rodent. Ostrich dumplings. And that appetite is about to cause the most famous mistake of his career. Out on the plains, the gauchos keep mentioning a bird. There are large flightless birds all over these grasslands. Rheas, which look roughly like ostriches and are the heaviest birds on the continent. Darwin has seen hundreds of them. But the gauchos tell him about a second kind further south. Smaller, darker, shorter in the leg, easier to bring down with bolus, but otherwise the same sort of animal. Darwin becomes fixated on finding one. He asks about it constantly. He goes looking. For months, he gets nothing. Then, in the last days of December 1833, at Port Desire on the Patagonian coast, the ship's artist goes out hunting to get meat for the crew and shoots a rhea. Darwin looks at it. It is on the small side. He assumes it is a juvenile of the common kind. He thinks nothing of it whatsoever. The bird is plucked, cooked, and served. And somewhere partway through the meal, sitting there eating it, Charles Darwin remembers what he's been searching for. What follows is one of the great undignified moments in the history of science. He gets up from the table and starts collecting the remains of his own dinner. He gathers the head, the neck, the legs, a wing, as much of the skin as he can rescue, and as many of the larger feathers as he can find. He preserved that pile of leftovers and shipped it to England, where a taxidermist assembled it into a specimen good enough to be displayed at the Zoological Society of London. The bird was confirmed as a distinct species, and it was named after him. That is the truth of it. One of the species carrying Charles Darwin's name is known to science from a bird he ate before he recognized it. But before we move on, notice what he'd actually stumbled into, because he noticed it himself and wrote it down. 2 kinds of rhea, very similar, not identical, and they occupy different ground. The larger one to the north, on the grasslands, the smaller one to the south, on the drier, colder plains. And there is a stretch where the 2 ranges overlap and both are present. 2 closely related animals, on one continent divided along a line drawn by the land itself. He does not know what to make of that yet. He writes it down. Into the crate it goes. Now, Patagonia. The Beagle spends a long time working this coast, and Darwin spends a long time walking on it, and what he finds there is nothing. I am using the word literally. The Patagonian plains are, in his description, sterile, flat, arid, covered in low, thorny scrub, with brackish water, no trees, no shelter, and almost no visible life. The plains rise from the sea in a series of gigantic flat steps, one above another, each one perfectly level, running for hundreds of kilometres. And Darwin, who is now getting very good at reading landscape, works out what those steps are. They are old sea floors. Each terrace is a former shoreline, raised out of the water and left stranded one after another as the land came up. There are shells scattered across their surfaces hundreds of feet above the modern beach. The whole eastern edge of the continent has been rising in steps over a span of time he cannot yet put a number on. And then there is the thing about those plains that he could never explain to himself. Years afterwards, sitting in England with the whole voyage behind him, the rainforest, the Andes, the Pacific Islands, the coral, Darwin asked himself which landscape had fixed itself most firmly in his memory. And the answer, to his own bafflement, was the Patagonian plains. They had nothing. No beauty in any conventional sense, no trees, no water worth drinking, nothing to look at. Everyone who crossed them said the same thing, and they haunted him more than any other place he'd ever been. His own explanation was that they offered no boundaries. On an ordinary landscape your eye stops somewhere. A hill, a wood, a building. On those plains there was nothing to stop it, and the mind ran on past the horizon into a country nobody had crossed and nobody had mapped, and the imagination filled it in. Something about a place that gives you nothing to look at forces you to look further than you otherwise would. He's now nearly 2 years into a voyage he was told would take 2 years, and he's been sending crates into silence the entire time, and the ship is turning south. They are heading for the bottom of the world, and for the strangest human encounter of the entire voyage, one that Darwin never resolved and never stopped thinking about. To understand what happens in Tierra del Fuego, you need to know something that happened before Darwin ever came aboard. On the Beagle's previous voyage, Fitzroy had a boat stolen. In response, a decision he would go on justifying for as long as he lived, he took 4 young Fuegians and kept them aboard. Then he made a choice that nobody expected. He took them to England. He paid for it largely himself. He had them taught English and Christianity and what he considered useful trades. One of them died of disease in England. The other 3 survived, learned to speak the language well, wore English clothes, and were presented at court to the King and Queen. They were given English names by the crew. The youngest of the 3 was a boy of about 14 when he was taken. The sailors called him Jemmy Button because Fitzroy had handed a large mother-of-pearl button to the man in the canoe with him. His actual name was Orundelico, and Fitzroy's plan for the second voyage, the one Darwin is on, was to take them home. Not just to drop them off, to establish them back in Tierra del Fuego as the seed of a mission, with a young English missionary and a quantity of supplies, and to see what happened. So for the entire first year of this voyage, Darwin's shipmates include 3 Fijian people crossing the Atlantic back toward the land they were taken from. He knew them well. That is easy to forget. On a ship 90 feet long, over more than a year, you know everyone. Darwin liked Jemmy enormously. He described him as cheerful, quick to laugh, sensitive to other people's feelings, and vain about his appearance. He polished his shoes and worried about his gloves. When Darwin was seasick, Jemmy was sympathetic about it. Then the ship reaches the southern channels and Darwin sees Tierra del Fuego for the first time. As places where human beings actually live, there are few harsher on this planet. Cold rain most of the year, wind that comes across the Southern Ocean with nothing in the way, steep forested slopes falling straight into black water, glaciers hanging above the channels, and almost no flat ground. And there are people living there, and have been for thousands of years, in canoes, with fire burning almost permanently in the bottom of the boat, because losing your fire in that cold and that wet could kill you. Darwin's reaction to meeting them is, by modern standards, ugly. There is no point pretending otherwise. He wrote about them in terms that are difficult to read now. He described them as barely believable, as the lowest condition of humanity he could imagine, and he told his family that he had never conceived of such a difference between people. He was 24, he had been raised in comfortable middle-class England, and he was looking at a way of living so far outside his experience that he had no framework for it at all. What he wrote was a failure of imagination, and it was a common one in his century, and it was still a failure. But here is what makes this stretch of the voyage worth your full attention. The voyage itself proceeded to demolish that judgment in front of him, and he recorded it demolishing itself, and he never quite put it back together. In January 1833, they land the 3 Fuegians at a place called Woollya, along with the young missionary and an almost comic quantity of English supplies, crockery, tools, wine glasses, tablecloths, and a set of chamber pots. They build huts, they plant gardens, they set up what Fitzroy sincerely believes is the beginning of a new kind of life for these islands. Within days, the missionary loses his nerve and asks to be taken off. The whole plan collapses almost immediately, and the Beagle sails away, leaving the 3 of them there. A year later, in early March 1834, the ship comes back. They anchor in the cove. The huts are there, and the gardens are trampled, and there is nobody in sight. Nothing moves on shore. Then a canoe appears in the distance, coming out toward the ship with a small flag flying from it. And as it gets closer, they can see one of the men in it washing paint off his face. Nobody on deck recognizes him until the canoe is alongside. It is Jemmy. He is thin. His hair is long and matted. He's wearing nothing but a piece of blanket around his waist. The clothes are gone. The shoes are gone. Everything is gone. Darwin wrote that he had never seen so complete and so grievous a change in a person, and that it was painful to look at him, and that Jemmy seemed ashamed and turned his back to the ship. Fitzroy brings him below immediately and gets him dressed. And then something happens that nobody aboard is prepared for. Cleaned up and sitting at the captain's table, Jemmy has not lost a single thing. He speaks English as well as he ever did. His manners at dinner are exactly what they were. He is composed, he is funny, he is entirely himself. He tells them what has happened, that the other 2 took his belongings and left in the night to go back to a different part of the islands. He has a wife now. She's out in the canoe, waiting, and he has been teaching her English. He has been teaching his brothers English. There is now, in one of the most remote inhabited places on the surface of the earth, a family speaking some English because of a boy who was taken to London and brought home. Fitzroy and Darwin offer to take him back to England. He says no. The reason he gives, as recorded, is that he has enough to eat, he is not cold, his relations are good people, and he does not want to go. Read that again. Because that is a man making a completely rational assessment of 2 available lives and choosing one, and everybody on that deck had assumed the choice was obvious in the other direction. Before the Beagle sails, Jemmy sends gifts out to the ship. 2 otter skins for Fitzroy, one for the man who'd been his teacher on the voyage, and a bow and arrows for a boy in England who'd been kind to him. Then he goes back to his canoe, and the ship leaves, and that night the crew can see a signal fire burning on the shore where he stood, burning until they lose sight of it. Darwin never saw him again. Nobody from that ship ever did. And Darwin never stopped thinking about it. He wrote about Jemmy Button decades later in a completely different book, still turning it over. The judgment he made when he first came into those channels, and the person he actually knew for a year and a half, never fit together properly, and to his credit, he did not force them to. One thread runs underneath all 5 of these years, and Jemmy is its clearest instance. Darwin turns up somewhere carrying a confident assumption. The place proceeds to contradict him, and he records the contradiction rather than the assumption. That habit is the entire reason we're talking about him tonight, and it is about to be tested harder than at any other point in the 5 years, because the Beagle is heading up the western coast of South America, and Darwin is about to see the ground itself move. But first, the Falkland Islands, and a small animal that is worth 2 minutes of your time. The Beagle spends time surveying the Falklands and Darwin goes ashore onto a treeless, windswept, boggy landscape with almost nothing living on it. There are birds. There are no native land mammals at all, with one exception. There is a fox, a single species of wild dog, found nowhere else on Earth, living on islands hundreds of kilometres from the continent with no other land mammal for company. How it got there was a puzzle then, and remains debated now, and it has no fear of people whatsoever. That is the detail that stayed with him. Sealers reported that the animals would walk directly into camps. They would approach a standing person out of curiosity. There are accounts of them being killed with nothing more than a knife held out in one hand and a piece of meat in the other. They had evolved on islands with no large predators, and nothing in their history had taught them that an approaching animal might be dangerous. So when a dangerous animal finally arrived by ship, they walked toward it. Darwin looked at this and made a prediction, plainly in his journal. Within a very few years, after those islands were properly settled, this animal would be extinct. He was right. The last known Falkland Islands wolf was killed in 1876. It was the first known canid to go extinct in historical times. Darwin had called it 40 years in advance, and he called it not by knowing anything special about the species, but by understanding a single fact about it, that it did not know how to be afraid, and that this was about to matter enormously. Now hold that alongside the bones in the mud bank at Punta Alta. He has now seen two ways for a kind of animal to vanish. One he watched arriving in slow motion and could explain completely. The other was already finished before he was born, and he could not explain it at all. The Beagle rounds the bottom of the continent and turns north, and everything changes. The western coast of South America is a different world from the eastern one, and it is a violent one. In January 1835, the Beagle is working the channels around the island of Chiloé in southern Chile. It rains almost constantly there. And on the night of the 19th, at around midnight, the sky to the east lights up. The volcano Osorno is erupting. Darwin gets up and watches it from the ship for hours. He describes a great column of dark material shooting upward and glowing fragments being thrown out and falling back down the sides of the cone, and the reflection of the fire on the water. That alone would be worth the trip. But then the reports start coming in, and they turn it into something else entirely. Two other volcanoes in the same range went into eruption on the same night. And when the news is collated properly, it turns out that a volcano more than 2,000 kilometres to the north had also become active at almost the same time. Darwin starts assembling something in his head. These are not separate events. Whatever is happening under the crust of this continent is connected along its whole length, and it is doing things simultaneously across distances that make no sense if you think of volcanoes as isolated local accidents. He is building toward an idea, and 1 month later the idea arrives and hits him personally. The 20th of February, 1835. Darwin is on shore near Valdivia in southern Chile. He has been walking, and he lies down in a wood to rest, and the ground starts to move. He wrote about it afterwards with the precision of someone who had been paying attention while frightened. It came on suddenly. It lasted about 2 minutes, though it felt much longer. He said the rocking of the ground was completely unmistakable, and he compared the sensation to standing on the deck of a ship being struck sideways by a wave. But the part he kept returning to was not physical. It was psychological. He wrote that an earthquake instantly destroys the oldest association a mind has. the assumption that the ground is solid. You spend your entire life standing on something you have never once questioned, and in a few seconds it moves under you, and it takes with it a certainty you did not even know you were carrying. He said it produced a feeling of insecurity that hours of reflection could not have produced. He was 200 miles from the worst of it. The Beagle sails north to Concepcion, and what they find there is a city that no longer exists. The earthquake, which modern estimates put at somewhere around magnitude 8.5, had struck at 11:30 in the morning. The shaking built over about 2 minutes. Then 3 tsunami waves came into the bay at Talcahuano, the port. The first ran up something like 23 feet. The largest wave measured along that coastline reached a run-up of around 24 meters. Darwin walks through the ruins. He sketches the shattered cathedral. He describes the town as the most awful spectacle of desolation he had ever seen. And Fitzroy, who is a surveyor before he is anything else, and who has an obsessive relationship with accurate measurement, does something that turns this from a disaster into a piece of evidence. He had surveyed this coastline the previous year. He had the numbers, so he goes out and surveys it again. The land is higher than it was, not metaphorically, measurably. The coast around Concepcion has been permanently lifted. In places the uplift was as much as 3 meters, though some of it settled back in the days afterward. And at the island of Santa Maria, about 30 miles away, Fitzroy finds the evidence in its most undeniable form. Beds of mussels still attached to the rocks where they'd been growing, sitting 10 feet above the high water mark and rotting in the open air. Those animals had been underwater, alive, going about their business on the morning of the 20th of February. By the afternoon, they were in the sky. The local people confirmed it independently, in the most practical way possible. There were places where they had previously had to dive for shellfish, and now they could simply walk out and pick them up. Now stop and let this land, because this is the moment the entire first half of the voyage snaps into place. Remember the white band of shells 45 feet up a hillside in the Cape Verde Islands on his very first landfall. Remember the giant flat terraces of Patagonia, one above another, each one an old sea floor stranded above the modern beach, with shells scattered across them. Darwin had inferred from both of those that land could rise out of the sea. It was an inference. It was reading a result and reasoning backwards to a cause he had never observed. At Concepcion, on a single morning in February 1835, he watched it happen. Not the whole process, few feet of it. But a few feet is all you need, because now you have a rate, you have a mechanism, you have proof that the crust of this planet moves vertically in observable amounts within a human lifetime. And if it can do that once, and it does it repeatedly along a coastline riddled with volcanoes that erupt in synchrony across 2,000 kilometres, then you do not need a catastrophe to build a mountain range. You just need this, over and over, for long enough. Darwin now wants to test it, and he knows exactly where to go. He's going to climb the Andes and look for the ocean. In March 1835, he sets out from Santiago with mules and a small party to cross the Cordillera to Mendoza on the Argentine side and come back by a different pass. He's going to do this twice, essentially, up and over one of the great mountain ranges on Earth, in order to read what the rock has to say. The ascent is brutal in a specific way that he describes clearly. Above a certain height, the party starts suffering from what the locals call puna, shortness of breath, headache, exhaustion, out of proportion to the effort. Darwin, being Darwin, notes the local cure for it, which is fossil shells, and observes dryly that this is a strange remedy, but that he found looking for the shells more effective than swallowing them, because he does find them. Up on the high passes at around 12,000 feet, in bare rock with snow around it, Charles Darwin picks fossil seashells out of a mountain. Not fragments, identifiable marine shells, in beds, in the rock of the range itself, thousands of meters above the ocean and hundreds of kilometres from it. That is the promise made at the start of tonight, and here it is delivered. The Andes are made in part of seafloor, but the mountain has not finished with him yet, because a few days later, on the way back through a different pass, he sees something on a bare slope that stops the entire party. White columns sticking out of the ground. He rides over to look at them. At an elevation of around 7,000 feet, on an open hillside in the middle of a continent, there is a small stand of trees, petrified, turned entirely to stone, 11 of them silicified, and 30 or 40 more converted into coarse white crystal. And critically, this is the detail that does the work, they are standing upright, in position, rooted where they grew. Now watch him assemble the story, because this is the sharpest single piece of reasoning in the whole 5 years, and he does it standing on the slope. These trees grew in soil, in open air, on a shore, because the rock beneath them says so. Then that shore sank, and went down beneath the sea, deep enough for layer upon layer of marine sediment to bury the stumps where they stood. Then volcanic material came up through it. Then the whole assembly, the drowned forest, the sediment, the lava, was lifted and kept being lifted until it stood 7,000 feet in the air, and then wind and rain stripped the covering away and exposed the stumps again. Sky, then sea, then sky. He wrote to his old teacher that the picture drawn in the rock of these great epochs of violence produced in his mind an effect he could hardly describe, and in a letter he admitted that the scale of what he was reading had become almost unbearable to hold. He's 26 years old, standing on a slope in the Andes, holding proof that the ground beneath everyone's feet has been up and down through an ocean more than once, and in the middle of this exact stretch, the highest, most productive weeks of the entire voyage, something happens to him at night that has haunted his biographers ever since. On the 26th of March 1835, in a village near Mendoza, Darwin is bitten by an insect. He wrote about it in detail because it interested him. The local name is the benchuca. It is a large black bug of the pampas, about an inch long, wingless and soft-bodied, and it comes out at night and feeds on the blood of sleeping animals and people. Darwin describes the sensation of feeling them crawling on his body as thoroughly disgusting. Then, being incapable of leaving anything alone, he catches one and experiments with it. He puts it on a table in front of a group of people, offers it a finger, and watches it feed. He records that it caused no pain, and that in under 10 minutes the insect went from being as flat as a wafer to being round. He notes that a single feed of that size kept the animal fat for 4 months. That insect is now known to be the principal carrier of a parasite that causes a disease called Chagas, and Chagas disease can lie dormant in a person for decades before producing exactly the kind of chronic symptoms that dominated the second half of Charles Darwin's life. Because here is the thing about him that people do not expect. He came home from this voyage and was ill on and off for the next 40-odd years. Stomach trouble, exhaustion, heart palpitations, spells that put him out of action for days at a time. He saw doctor after doctor. Nobody ever gave him an answer, and the argument over what was actually wrong with him is still running today. Chagas is one candidate. The timing works, the bite is documented in his own hand, the symptoms fit. Others have argued for entirely different explanations, including conditions that would have nothing to do with South America at all. There is no consensus. There may never be one. I am flagging that clearly rather than tidying it up, because a documented insect bite in a notebook is not a diagnosis, and anyone who tells you the case is closed is going further than the evidence goes. But it is a strange thing to sit with. The single most productive month of his travelling life, on a mountainside where he read the history of a continent out of a slope of rock. And there is a real possibility that in the same week, in a hut in a village below, something got into him that never left. He came down out of the Andes with 2 crates of specimens, a notebook full of the best geology he would ever do, and, quite possibly, a passenger. The Beagle works north along the Chilean and Peruvian coast. Darwin sees the desert country of the north, and Lima, and by now he's been away for 3 years and 9 months, on a voyage that was supposed to have ended 21 months ago. And on the 15th of September, 1835, the ship arrives at a group of volcanic islands on the equator, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and stays for 5 weeks. Everyone knows the name. Almost nobody knows what actually happened there. The Galapagos. And the first thing to fix is the picture in your head, because the popular version of this stop is wrong in almost every particular, and the true version happens to be far more interesting. Start with what Darwin actually saw when he stepped ashore, because it was not paradise. It was black rock. The Galapagos are young volcanic islands, and much of the surface is bare lava. Broken, sharp, dark, radiating heat, with stunted leafless brush growing out of the cracks. Darwin walked across ground where the sun on black rock made the air over it shimmer. He described the landscape as what you might imagine the cultivated regions of hell to look like. The whole archipelago, he wrote, was riddled with craters. He counted around 60 of them on one part of one island alone. It is a landscape of chimneys, and on this burnt, waterless, hostile rock, there is a collection of animals that exist nowhere else in the universe. Let's start with the ones that made the biggest impression on him, because it was not the finches, the tortoises. They are enormous. Darwin measured shells 6 and 8 feet around. He tried to lift one and could not. Some of these animals weigh over 200 kilograms, and Lawson, the acting governor, told him he had seen individuals that took 6 or 8 men to move. And they had roads. I mean actual roads. The tortoises on those islands need fresh water, and fresh water exists only at springs in the higher central parts of the islands. So the animals walk up, drink, and walk back down, and they have been doing this on the same routes for so many generations that their feet have worn broad, obvious paths into the volcanic ground. Darwin followed the paths. He wrote that they were used by everyone on the islands, including the Spanish settlers, who had originally found the springs by simply following the tortoises. At the water, he watched them arrive and drink. He described them burying their heads in the spring above the eyes and swallowing steadily, about 10 mouthfuls a minute, completely indifferent to the presence of a man standing over them watching. He timed their walking speed and found they moved faster than he had assumed. He calculated something like 6 kilometres a day if an animal kept at it. And then, because he was 26 years old and the opportunity was there, he climbed onto their backs. He got on top of a giant tortoise, rapped on the shell to make it move and rode it, trying not to slide off as it walked. He wrote about how difficult it was to keep his balance. Now, the marine iguanas. These are the only lizards in the world that feed in the sea. They are black, blunt-headed, about 1 metre long, and they gather on the lava in enormous numbers along the shoreline. Darwin found them ugly and said so repeatedly. He called them imps of darkness. He was unimpressed by their sluggishness on land. But then he noticed something that genuinely puzzled him, and he ran an experiment on it, and that experiment may be the single most entertaining passage in his entire journal. These animals swim beautifully. In the water they are fast, powerful, completely at home. They dive to feed on seaweed. The sea is their food supply and their element, and yet when you frighten one on land, it will not go into the water. It runs away from the sea. Darwin could not accept this. So he picked one up, carried it to a deep tidal pool and threw it in. It swam straight back to him and climbed out. He picked it up and threw it in again. Same result. He did this repeatedly. His own account admits to doing it over and over. And every single time the lizard swam back to the exact spot where he was standing and hauled itself out onto the rock, at the feet of the large animal that had just thrown it into the water. He worked out the answer, and it is the same answer as the Falkland fox arrived at from the opposite direction. On land, that iguana has no predators. Nothing on those islands hunts it ashore, but in the water there are sharks. So the animal's entire instinct is built around one rule. Whatever is happening, get to the rock. The rock is safe. Deep water is not. That rule is completely correct, and it has kept the species alive, and it is absolutely no use at all against a man from Shropshire with an idle afternoon and a research question. Now the tortoises again, because this is where the story turns. The acting governor of the islands was an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson. He came down to meet the ship, and in conversation, casually as a piece of local knowledge, the way you might mention which bakery is better, he told Darwin something remarkable. He said that the tortoises were different on different islands, and that he could look at any tortoise brought to him and tell you, with certainty, which island it had come from. Shell shape, size, the way the front of the shell was built. Each island had its own kind. This is not an outsider's insight. The people who lived there already knew it. It was ordinary information, the sort of thing that gets mentioned and moved past. Darwin heard it, and by his own admission, his own words written later, he did not pay sufficient attention to it at the time. Slow down on that one, because it is the piece of the Galapagos story that never makes it into the textbooks. The single most famous naturalist in history was standing on the single most famous islands in the history of biology, and a local administrator handed him the key fact of the place in a passing remark, and he filed it under interesting and carried on. It gets worse, and I mean that admiringly, because the honesty of the record here is remarkable. Darwin and the crew took around 45 tortoises aboard as food. They were not scientific specimens, they were provisions, live meat that could be stored on deck for months without feeding, which is precisely why whalers had been hunting these animals almost to collapse for decades. The Beagle ate them on the way across the Pacific, and the remains went over the side. Some of the shells were kept and used as bowls and plates. So the tortoises that Lawson told him differed island by island. The ones Darwin might have compared directly, if he'd understood what he was being told, went into the ocean somewhere west of the Galapagos. Now, the birds. Here is the correction that matters most, and I want to be precise about it, since the version everybody has heard is essentially a legend. Darwin did not have a revelation about finches in the Galapagos. What actually caught his attention there was a different bird entirely, the mockingbirds. He collected one on the first island. Then, on a second island, he shot another, and he happened to look closely, and he noticed that it was noticeably different from the first. not a little different, distinctly different. From that point on, he paid careful attention to the mockingbirds and, crucially, he labelled them by island. Which island? Every specimen. That labelling is the single most important act of the entire 5-year voyage, and it happened almost by chance, because he happened to glance at a second bird carefully. The finches, by contrast, he collected in numbers and did not label by island. He put them together as coming from the Galapagos generally. Why? Because at the time he did not think they mattered. They are small, drab, brownish birds that all look broadly similar, and he had no reason to imagine that a bird that could obviously fly would be confined to one island a few kilometres from another one. That decision cost him, and he knew it later. There is one more piece, and it arrives right at the end of his time there, and it is the moment the whole thing starts to move in his mind. On the last island, someone tells him that the plants are the same story, that the trees and shrubs also differ from island to island, and that begins to connect to what Lawson said about the tortoises and to what he had seen with his own eyes in the mockingbirds. 3 separate kinds of living thing, same pattern. Islands within sight of one another in the same climate on the same kind of rock, and each one carrying its own version of the same creature. 9 months later, still at sea, still with no answers from England, Darwin opened his ornithological notes and wrote down a sentence that is one of the most cautious and most explosive things he ever put on paper. He wrote that, when he considered these islands in sight of each other, holding a small number of animals, inhabited by these birds which differ only slightly in structure and fill the same role in nature, he must suspect they are only varieties. And then he wrote that if there were any foundation to these remarks, the fact would undermine the stability of species. If, would, must suspect. That is not a man who has had a revelation. That is a man who has noticed something he does not want to have noticed, hedging it in every direction, writing it down anyway because he is honest. He would not publish anything on it for more than 20 years. And the ending of the Galapagos story is the most human part of it. When Darwin got home, the mockingbirds went to an expert ornithologist, who examined them and reported that they were not local varieties at all. They were separate species, and each one belonged to a specific island, exactly as the labels said. Darwin then went to the finches with a very different question in mind, and found that he had ruined his own evidence. The labels were not there. The islands were not recorded, so he had to reconstruct it from other people's collections. Fitzroy had collected finches and labelled them by island. So had Fitzroy's steward. So had Darwin's own assistant, a young man named Sims Covington. 3 other men on that ship had been more careful than the naturalist. Their labels are the reason the Galapagos finches are famous. And you should know that those finches are barely mentioned in the book he eventually wrote in 1859. They are not the origin story. They became the origin story afterwards, told and retold until it became the version everyone knows. The real story is a man who missed the point in the moment, went home, was corrected by other people, and had the intellectual honesty to go back and admit what he had failed to record. The Beagle leaves the Galapagos on the 20th of October 1835 with around 45 tortoises on deck and heads out into the Pacific. 3,200 miles of open ocean later, they reach Tahiti. And Darwin, who has spent 4 years being astonished, is astonished again in a completely different register. He goes inland with a small group of Tahitian guides, up a river valley into the interior of the island, and what he describes is a landscape of near vertical green walls, waterfalls, and a gorge so steep that the route involves climbing rock faces with ropes made of plant fibre. His guides move through this terrain in a way that leaves him almost speechless. They climb barefoot up faces he needs help with. They make fire, build a shelter, cook a meal of fish and bananas wrapped in leaves in a pit of hot stones, and produce a functioning camp out of nothing but the forest in the time it takes him to catch his breath. He wrote that they were fine men and that he could not have wished for better companions. That is Charles Darwin at 26, 4 years out of England, the same person who wrote those ugly lines about Tierra del Fuego 2.5 years earlier. What changed was not his politics. What changed was that he kept meeting people and paying attention. New Zealand in December 1835 he disliked. He said so bluntly and did not linger. Australia in January 1836 produces one of the strangest small moments of the entire voyage. He rides inland from Sydney, and one afternoon by a river he watches a group of small amphibious animals playing in the water. They are, he thinks, water rats. Except they are not. They are platypuses. And Darwin sits down and has a genuine crisis about it, right there on a riverbank in New South Wales, and he wrote it down. His point was this: in England there are water rats, ordinary rodents that swim, dive, live in riverbanks, and feed in the water. In Australia, the same job in the same kind of river is being done by an animal that is not a rodent, that lays eggs, that has a bill like a duck, and that is unlike anything in the Northern Hemisphere. Two totally different animals, built from totally different starting material, arriving at almost exactly the same solution to the same problem. He wrote that an unbeliever might look at this and conclude that two separate creators had been at work. Then, characteristically, he went and lay down under a tree and watched an antlion, a small insect that digs a conical pit in sand and waits at the bottom for prey to fall in. And he realised that the Australian antlion built exactly the same pit as the European one, in exactly the same way. Different continent, different creature, identical trap. He did not know what to do with the observation. He noted, honestly, that he could not resolve it. Into the notebook it went, and onto the ship, and into the boxes. And then, in April 1836, the Beagle reaches a small ring of coral in the Indian Ocean, and Darwin gets the one great idea he actually completed during the voyage itself. The Cocos Islands, a classic atoll, a narrow, low ring of coral and sand enclosing a shallow lagoon in the middle of very deep ocean, with no mountain, no rock, nothing else visible for hundreds of kilometres. And the question that had defeated every naturalist who had looked at these things was simple to ask and impossible to answer. Reef-building coral cannot live in deep water. It needs sunlight. Below, roughly 40 or 50 metres, it dies. So how do you get a ring of coral standing in an ocean 4,000 metres deep? There are only two possibilities anyone could see. Either the coral grew up from the deep seabed, which is impossible because it cannot live down there, or every atoll in the Pacific and Indian Oceans happens to sit on top of a submerged mountain whose summit reaches to precisely the right depth. Every single one. All of them at the same magic level. Both answers are absurd. That was the coral reef problem, and it was genuinely one of the outstanding puzzles in the natural sciences. Darwin solved it on the west coast of South America before he'd ever laid eyes on an atoll, and he solved it because of the mussels rotting on the rocks above the tide line at Santa Maria. Follow the logic because it is beautiful. He had just spent 3 years proving that land rises. That was the entire lesson of the Cape Verde shell band, the Patagonian terraces, the Andean seashells, the Concepcion earthquake. So he asked the obvious next question, the one nobody bothers to ask. If land can rise in one part of the world, then somewhere else it must be sinking. Now put a volcanic island in the middle of a tropical ocean and start it sinking very slowly. Coral grows in the shallow water around its edge as a fringing reef. The island sinks a little. The coral, which lives in the sunlit zone, keeps growing upward to stay in the light. The island sinks more. The coral keeps building on the skeletons of its own dead, upward, always upward, staying at the surface. The gap between the shrinking island and the reef widens into a lagoon. Eventually the island's last peak goes under, and what is left, floating at the surface with nothing visible beneath it, is a ring of living coral standing on a column of its own dead ancestors, hundreds of meters thick, sitting on top of a drowned mountain nobody will ever see. An atoll is the outline of an island that is no longer there. Darwin came to Cocos to test this, and he went looking for evidence of sinking. He found undercut and collapsing shorelines, coconut palms toppling into the water where the land was being lost, and dead coral in places that suggested the ring was struggling to hold its position. He and the officers considered it good enough to be broadly conclusive. He also, being incapable of resting, waded out onto the reef flat with a glass-bottom viewing box and simply looked at the living coral for hours. And here is the payoff, and it took a very long time to arrive. Darwin's explanation was fought over for the rest of the 19th century. A serious rival theory had prominent backing, and expeditions were funded specifically to prove Darwin wrong. He said himself, near the end of his life, that the whole argument could be settled by drilling into an atoll and seeing what was underneath. He died in 1882 without an answer. The answer came in 1952 at Enewetak Atoll in the Pacific, when the United States drilled deep test holes into the reef before nuclear testing. They went down through coral, and more coral, and more coral. At around 1,287 meters, over 1,400 meters in one of the holes, the drill came out of coral limestone and into basalt. Volcanic rock. A drowned mountain, exactly where Darwin said it would be, under more than a kilometre of coral built up over roughly 30 million years by animals a few millimetres across, growing upward at exactly the pace the seabed sank beneath them. He was right. It took 116 years and a nuclear weapons program to confirm it, and it came out of a young man reasoning from rotten mussels on a Chilean rock. The voyage home is almost over, and it contains 2 moments worth your time. The first is on Ascension Island, in the middle of the Atlantic in July 1836. Mail catches up with the ship and Darwin opens a letter from his sister, and he learns, at the age of 27, on a volcanic rock in the ocean, that he is already famous. His old teacher in Cambridge had been receiving those crates for 4 years. He had also been receiving Darwin's letters, long, detailed, enthusiastic letters about fossils and geology, written by a young man on the other side of the world with no idea anyone else would read them. The teacher had selected extracts, had them printed as a pamphlet, and circulated them among the scientific societies of Britain. Darwin's fossils had been shown, his name had been discussed. His work was being taken seriously by men whose approval he had never dared hope for. He had no idea. He found out from a letter from his sister, years after the fact, standing on a beach in the South Atlantic. His first reaction was mild horror. He would have liked to check his own letters for accuracy before they went into print. His second reaction is one of the best sentences he ever wrote about himself, that he went up over the mountains of Ascension with a bounding step and made the volcanic rocks ring under his geological hammer. 4 years of mailing boxes into silence, and the silence finally answered. The second moment is more human, and it made him furious. They're almost home. Africa is behind them, and Fitzroy announces that they are turning around and recrossing the Atlantic to Bahia in Brazil. The reason is a discrepancy in the longitude measurements. The whole point of this voyage was to run a chain of chronometer readings around the planet and have the final measurement close perfectly onto the starting one. There is a small error, and Fitzroy will not accept it, and so he takes his ship back across an ocean to remeasure a point they visited 4 years earlier. Darwin, who has been away for nearly 5 years, who is desperate to see his family, who's been seasick for the entire duration, records exactly how he felt about this, and it is not restrained. He hated the sea, he said, and everything about a ship, and the delay was almost unendurable. But Fitzroy got his number. When the final chain of measurements was closed and checked, the accumulated error around the entire circumference of the Earth was 33 seconds. That is what this voyage was actually for. Not fossils, not finches. A set of charts and a chain of longitude so precise that ships could trust it, and a captain stubborn enough to cross an ocean twice, rather than accept an imperfect number. On the 2nd of October, 1836, the Beagle anchors at Falmouth, in Cornwall, in the rain, at night. Charles Darwin gets off the ship. He does not wait for morning. He takes the mail coach north through the night and across the country, and he arrives at his father's house in Shrewsbury late the following night, and rather than wake anyone, he goes to bed. He walked into the breakfast room the next morning. 5 years, less about 3 months. He had been told 2, and here is the fact that finishes the story, and it always stops me. Charles Darwin never left Britain again. Not once, for the remaining 45 years of his life. The man who circled the planet, rode across the Andes, stood on the equator among giant tortoises, walked in a rainforest and felt a continent shift beneath him, would live out every remaining year within a few hundred miles of the house he had just walked into. Everything he ever wrote afterwards was written from inside those 5 years in a quiet village in Kent, from notebooks and crates. So what was actually in the boxes? Because that is what came home. Not a theory, not a manuscript, crates. Nearly 1,500 specimens preserved in spirits. Something close to 4,000 more. Skins, bones, rocks and dried material. Just under 1,000 pressed plant sheets. Around 500 bird skins plus additional birds preserved in fluid, plus parts, nests and eggs. Fossil mammals, volcanic rock, coral, insects in numbers he had long since given up counting properly. And 18 small field notebooks, written in pencil, on horseback, in a hammock, on a slope in the Andes. From the birds alone, 39 species and subspecies new to science were eventually described. From the fossil mammals, an anatomist in London named Richard Owen worked through Darwin's bones over the following years and formally named 11 creatures. Several of them carry Darwin's name to this day, attached to animals he pulled out of a 20-foot mud bank with a borrowed pickaxe when he was 23 years old. And the packet of dust he scraped off the masthead in the Cape Verdes went to Berlin and turned into a small scientific paper of its own. Now, the bones. I promised you at the very start of this that he carried home a puzzle he could not solve, and it is time to open it properly. Take a slow breath first, because this one is still open. Go back to that cliff at Punta Alta and look at what is in the mud. A ground sloth the size of an elephant. A second one. A third. An armadillo relative built like a small car. A long-necked grazer. A native horse. A creature with a skull that fits nothing. 9 great mammals in one low bank of soft rock. And in the same beds, shellfish that are still alive on the beach 50 meters away. and still walking around on that same continent, in the same country, on the same grass, sloths, armadillos, guanacos, smaller, living, doing fine. So what happened? Here is what we know now that Darwin could not have known. We can date it. The great extinction of South American megafauna happened as the last glacial period was closing, very roughly around 12,000 years ago, with the details varying by species and region. In geological terms, that is not the distant past. That is yesterday afternoon. Human beings had already built villages by the end of it, and it was not a South American event. It happened across the Americas. It happened in Australia. It happened, to a lesser extent, in northern Eurasia. Across continent after continent, in a relatively narrow band of time, the largest land animals disappeared and the smaller ones survived. The pattern is brutally consistent and it is size selective. Above a certain body mass, you are gone. Below it, you are still here. That is why Darwin's dead giants and his living small relatives are the same animals in two sizes. It was not a lottery. Something was specifically removing the big ones, and the cause is still argued about tonight. There are two main candidates, and neither has won. The first is climate. As the last glaciation gave way, the world went through enormous and rapid environmental change. Temperature, rainfall, vegetation, the whole structure of the habitats these animals depended on, rearranging within a few thousand years. Large animals with slow reproduction and huge food requirements are exactly the animals least able to absorb that kind of disruption. The second is us. Human beings arrived in the Americas during this same window. Large, slow animals with no evolutionary experience of a coordinated pack-hunting predator are, as a category, extremely easy to kill. And there is a version of this that requires no dramatic slaughter at all. Just a modest, sustained pressure on the breeding population of a species that takes many years to reach maturity and produces few young. Do that for long enough, and the arithmetic finishes the job on its own. The honest position, and the one most researchers now hold, is that it was probably some combination, climate stress and human arrival landing on the same populations at the same time, with the balance between them differing from continent to continent and from species to species. And that is not a tidy answer, and there is no consensus on the proportions, and there are respected scientists arguing hard on both sides right now. Nearly 200 years after Charles Darwin pulled those bones out of that cliff, we still cannot tell you with confidence why they are bones. But there is one thing we can now tell you that he could not, and it is the part I want to leave with you. Remember the Falkland Islands fox, the animal that walked toward people because nothing in its history had taught it to run. Darwin looked at it and predicted its end 40 years in advance, and the prediction came true in 1876. He saw that exact mechanism operating on an island, in his own lifetime, in slow motion. He described it precisely, and he never connected it to the bones. He never wrote that the giants of South America might have gone the same way, for the same reason, on a larger stage. He had both halves of the idea in the same set of notebooks, and he did not put them together. He had no reason to. In 1836, nobody knew when humans had reached the Americas. Nobody could date a fossil bed, and the tools to even ask the question would not exist for another century. He just wrote it all down and sent it home in a box. There are two honest ways to hold this voyage, and you do not have to pick one before you sleep. The first is that this was one young man looking at the world with more attention than almost anyone had ever paid it. He was not clever in the way we imagine geniuses are clever. He was not fast. He guessed wrong in public about an octopus. He ate the bird he was looking for. He failed to label the finches. He was handed the central fact of the Galapagos by a colonial administrator in casual conversation and did not act on it. What he had instead was stamina and a specific kind of honesty, the willingness to write down the thing that contradicted him rather than the thing he expected. 5 years of that, 18 notebooks of that. It is not a glamorous quality, and it is the entire reason any of this mattered. The second thing is equally true, and it is that the Beagle was not a research vessel. She was a Royal Navy survey ship, and her purpose was to produce charts accurate enough for the British Empire to move ships and goods along a coastline that other people already lived on. That is what the 22 chronometers were for. That is what the 33 seconds was for. The naturalist was a passenger, and the voyage carried 3 Fuegian people home as part of an experiment that was conducted on them rather than with them, and that failed, and that a young man on that deck watched fail and recorded with more sympathy than he arrived with, and less than they deserved. Both of those are the same voyage. The charts and the notebooks came out of the same ship, in the same 5 years, paid for by the same government, and you do not have to resolve them tonight. Let's go back over where we have been. We left Plymouth in the last week of December 1831 on a 90-foot ship with 74 people aboard, with a young man in a hammock over a chart table who'd been told he would be home in 2 years. We stood at a white band of shells 45 feet up a hillside in the Cape Verde Islands and watched him understand for the first time that land can rise. We walked into a Brazilian forest loud enough to hear from a ship offshore and turned over a log and found more life under it than a person could catalogue in a lifetime. We dug 9 impossible animals out of 20 feet of red mud in Argentina and found shellfish in the same layer that were still alive on the beach below. We rode with gauchos and knocked over our own horse. We ate the rare bird we'd been searching for and then gathered it off the plates. We stood on the emptiest plains on earth and could not work out why they refused to leave our memory. We watched a canoe come out of a cove at the bottom of the world with a small flag flying and a man in it washing paint from his face, and we did not recognize him until he was alongside. And then we watched him sit down to dinner, speak perfect English, and choose not to come with us. We lay down in a wood near Valdivia and felt the ground move and lost something we did not know we'd been holding. We walked through the ruins of Concepcion and found mussels rotting in the air 10 feet above the sea, still stuck to the rock where they'd been living that morning. We climbed to 12,000 feet and picked seashells out of a mountain, and then rode past a stand of trees turned to white stone, standing upright where they had grown on a shore that had since been to the bottom of an ocean and back. We rode a tortoise. We threw a lizard into a rock pool over and over and watched it swim back to us every time. We were told which island each tortoise came from, and we did not write it down. And we came home in the rain to Falmouth at night, after 5 years, and took a coach across a whole country rather than wait until morning. Some of it never got answered, and it does not need answering tonight. Whether the thing that bit him in a village below the Andes in March 1835 was the thing that made him ill for the next 40 years. The notebook records the bite, the symptoms fit, and the case has never been closed. Whether Jemmy Button, sitting at the captain's table in borrowed clothes speaking flawless English and then going back to his canoe, ever regretted the answer he gave. He was not asked again. Nobody from that ship ever saw him after that night. And why the giants went when their small cousins stayed, the sloths and the armadillos and the long-necked grazers, gone from a continent that kept every one of their smaller relations in a mud bank full of shells that are still on the beach. Nobody has settled that last one. It is being argued about this year. The cliff at Punta Alta is still there, still low, still soft, still giving up bones. The petrified trees still stand on their slope at the head of the Uspallata Pass, and you can drive past them on the road between Mendoza and Santiago. The tortoise roads on those islands are still worn into the lava by feet that have been walking them since before Darwin got on their backs. And somewhere under the Pacific, more than a kilometre beneath a ring of coral, there is a drowned volcano that a seasick 26-year-old worked out was there by looking at dead mussels on a rock in Chile. If this carried you through the hours, the like button is the only signal that reaches me. A single tap, nothing more, and it tells me these are worth making. Subscribe if you want to come along on the next one. I intend to keep hunting for the tellings that survive a proper fact check and delivering them slowly in the dark for whoever is still awake. And since this one was 5 years of a man writing down where he was and what was in front of him, tell me below where you are and what your clock says. Someone reading this is at a kitchen table in Manila in the middle of the afternoon, and someone else is lying in the dark in Cairo or Lisbon or Chicago at 4 a.m. I like knowing. Let the plains keep whatever it was that made them unforgettable. Let the bones in that cliff keep the rest of their argument a while longer. Rest easy. The tortoises are still walking their roads tonight, on the same paths, at the same unhurried pace, in the dark, exactly as they were on the afternoon a young man climbed onto one of their backs and held on.